It was supposed to be a normal climb, but something felt off from the moment they stepped into the fog. The mist swirled thickly around the rocky cliffs, swallowing everything in its path. Barry's heart pounded in his chest as he hung midair. His fingers slipped on the cold, wet rock. The sharp chill of the wind bit at his skin, and the damp, musty scent of the stone filled his nose. He could hear the distant roar of a waterfall somewhere below, mixing with the hollow echo of his own ragged breaths. His breaths were shallow, his body frozen, not from the height, but from the feeling that someone or something was watching. He glanced down at Clay, who was usually unshakable, but now stood pale, trembling, ropes loose in his hands. Above them, Jen and Nicole laughed, that same eerie, bone-chilling laugh that had echoed all day. Their movements seemed impossible, leaping from rock to rock with an ease that defied gravity. Barry's throat tightened. How could they move like that? And why did their laughter sound inhuman? Barry's grip slipped further as he realized the truth that had been gnawing at him all day. They weren't alone on this climb. Something far more dangerous than the cliffs was with them. To understand how it all began, we need to go back to where the journey started. Barry, a 22-year-old geology student, loved outdoor adventures. His passion for extreme sports, especially rock climbing, had not only made him strong physically, but also sharpened his mental toughness. As a high-achieving student, Barry often spent his free time conquering steep cliffs. Although Rock Spring was a small town, it was known for its amazing natural scenery. The town, located in southwestern Wyoming, was surrounded by hills and cliffs. Barry's neighbor Clay, who lived just a block away, was also into extreme sports. Clay, a 23-year-old who had been friends with Barry for a long time, shared the same love for adrenaline-filled activities. They often planned adventures together, tackling the steep cliffs that only the bravest would dare to climb. The two of them agreed to spend the weekend at Grand Teton National Park, one of the most popular places for climbers in Wyoming. Grand Teton was famous for its dramatic mountain range, surrounded by lakes, wilderness, and challenging cliffs. Barry drove full of excitement, while Clay sat in the passenger seat, busy checking their gear and mapping out the hiking route they planned to take. As they approached Grand Teton, the bright weather began to change. The air grew cooler, and the sunlight dimmed as dark clouds gathered, hanging low in the sky. Barry felt a bit uneasy but brushed it off. Climbing in bad weather could be dangerous, but they had faced worse conditions on harder climbs. But this time, something felt different. As they entered the Grand Teton area, thick fog suddenly wrapped around the road, limiting their visibility. Clay, usually cheerful, suddenly grew quiet. "Do you feel something strange?" he asked softly, his voice almost drowned out by the hum of the car's engine. Barry nodded, though he was reluctant to admit the strange feeling creeping into his mind, partly because he didn't want to worry Clay, and partly because he feared that something truly unnatural was happening. "Maybe it's just normal fog. We've faced worse than this, right?" Barry replied, trying to stay calm. A dense fog covered Grand Teton National Park as Barry and Clay arrived. They parked the car in an empty camping area. The overcast sky cast faint shadows over the towering cliffs. The air felt damp, and the cold slowly seeped into their bones. They had planned a weekend full of adventure, climbing the steep and challenging cliffs surrounded by the beauty of the wild. After setting up their tent and preparing their gear, the atmosphere lightened a bit. They weren't alone. Nearby, two young women were busy with their own equipment. Barry watched from a distance, and without saying a word, Clay waved to them. Barry nodded, letting his friend start the conversation. Nicole and Jen, both 21 years old, were from Ohio. They looked excited for the adventure. Nicole had blonde hair and tanned skin, while Jen, with her short black hair, seemed more energetic and eager to get started. They had come to experience the thrill of climbing the famous cliffs of Grand Teton. The initial conversation was light and friendly, full of smiles and laughter. Nicole mentioned it was their first time in Wyoming, while Jen added that they wanted to challenge themselves with a tougher climb. Clay, always up for adventure, immediately suggested they practice together. The two girls hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed. The four of them set off to the climbing route that Clay had mapped out. The afternoon fog seemed to stick around, obscuring their view of the towering peaks. But their spirits stayed high. This was the kind of adventure they wanted. As they started climbing, Jen, being smaller and more agile, moved faster than the muscular Clay. The sound of heavy breathing and the ropes rubbing against the rocks created a rhythm to their climb. Nicole and Barry followed at a more cautious pace from below. But as they climbed, Barry started to feel uneasy. Through the fog, he occasionally saw shadows, as if something was moving quickly between the gaps in the cliffs. It was fleeting, like a quick movement, and then it disappeared. Barry tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the fog playing tricks on him. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Every time he looked around, there was nothing. Just the sight of large, cold, lifeless rocks. Still, the feeling grew stronger inside him. Something unnatural was hiding among them. The fog thickened even more, blurring their vision. Barry's breathing grew heavier, not from exhaustion, but from growing anxiety. Without saying a word, he glanced at Nicole, who remained calm and focused. Yet nothing could shake the subtle fear that was starting to stir deep inside him. Barry noticed something strange again. While on the cliff, Nicole made an impressive leap from one small handhold to another. The move required incredible precision and strength, something only experienced climbers could pull off. Yet Nicole jumped with ease, as if gravity didn't affect her. Clay, who was below as the belayer, could only watch in disbelief. "Amazing," Clay muttered, though there was a hint of doubt in his voice as he occasionally took photos and videos with his phone. What made Barry uneasy was the way Nicole laughed after landing. That laugh, it didn't sound like a normal human laugh. It was cold, echoing, almost mysterious. At the same time, Jen showed similar strange behavior. On one route, the cliff in front of her seemed impossible to climb without using a technique where the climber presses their shoes tightly against a nearly smooth rock surface with no clear handholds. Yet Jen calmly walked up the rock face as if she were walking on flat ground. There was no extra effort, no strain on her face. She moved as though gravity didn't exist around her. Barry swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on Jen's every move. "Is she really doing that?" he thought. He glanced over at Clay, who also seemed puzzled. Every time Nicole and Jen managed to pull off what seemed like impossible moves, they would laugh that strange, eerie laugh. It echoed unnaturally through the quiet Grand Teton cliffs, with a tone that felt off. It wasn't the laughter of someone relieved or joyful after completing a difficult climb. It was more like a laugh coming from a dark, cold place. As they climbed higher, the oddities only got worse. On the toughest route, a nearly vertical cliff with very few footholds or handholds, Jen suddenly jumped. It wasn't a normal climbing move, but something that required extreme skill. Her hands seemed to need no holds, and her feet clung to the wall like magnets. Barry could only stare, his mouth hanging open. "Clay, this doesn't make sense," Barry whispered, his voice trembling as he began to realize that something very unnatural was happening. Clay didn't respond, just stared with wide eyes. The tension in the air grew thicker, and Barry felt a chill creeping up his spine. Every movement Nicole and Jen made, though graceful and skilled, felt increasingly wrong, as if they weren't normal climbers, or even human. Barry couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to these girls than just their abilities. There was an unnatural aura about them, something in the way they moved and the coldness of their laughter, that made Barry think they were hiding a dark secret, perhaps something supernatural or sinister, far beyond what they had said. Whenever they came close, he felt a coldness wrap around him, like an icy breath coming from nowhere. Nicole and Jen's behavior became stranger over time, and Barry began to wonder who these girls really were. Despite his uneasy feeling, they all finished the climbing session as nightfall approached and returned to their tents. That evening, after a full day of climbing, Barry, Clay, Nicole, and Jen gathered around a campfire. The flames flickered, casting an orange glow on their faces in the darkness of the mountains. At first, the mood was relaxed. They laughed, sharing stories of past climbing experiences, talking about the challenges and the rush of adrenaline when their feet gripped the steep rocks and their fingers searched for holds on slippery surfaces. Nicole and Jen spoke excitedly, as if they weren't strangers to danger, even enthusiastically discussing the most treacherous cliffs. Occasionally, they captured moments together with their phone cameras. However, the night took on a different feel when their conversation was suddenly interrupted by the distant howl of wolves shattering the silence. The sound came from deep within the trees surrounding the campsite, but gradually the howls grew closer. Unlike the usual single wolf cry, these howls echoed back and forth, forming an eerie harmony, as if something was calling through the valley. Barry and Clay exchanged uneasy glances. Barry tried to ignore the discomfort, attempting to lighten the mood with a joke. But the howls couldn't be dismissed. Each one sounded different, some long and raspy, others short and sharp. It wasn't just the wolves. Occasionally, they heard what sounded like heavy footsteps in the distance, the snap of breaking branches, and an unusual owl call that resembled a scream more than a hoot. The sounds of the Grand Teton forest that night were unlike any normal night, as if something was hiding in the shadows. "Something feels off tonight," Clay muttered, his eyes fixed on the trees swaying gently in the wind. Though the wind wasn't strong, it howled fiercely, carrying faint whispers that reached Barry's ears, as if the forest itself was speaking in a language humans couldn't understand. The sky, once clear and full of stars, slowly became covered with dark clouds. A light rain began to fall, dampening the ground around them. The once bright campfire started to dim, as if responding to the change in atmosphere. The flames flickered, almost going out, but each time they dimmed, they would burst back with wilder sparks, casting dancing shadows across their faces. Jen and Nicole kept laughing, but their laughter still sounded strange and mysterious, echoing through the fog and sending chills down Barry and Clay's spines. There was something about the way they looked at each other. Their eyes seemed odd, filled with a strange glint that was hard to explain. Barry occasionally glanced their way, feeling that something was wrong, but he couldn't quite figure out what was bothering him. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or perhaps it was just the unnatural feeling of the night. But Barry decided not to dwell on it too much. Moments later, the wind picked up, sounding as if someone were speaking through its gusts. Barry's ears caught faint tones within it, though he couldn't make out any words. It wasn't just the sound of the wind. It was like someone whispering in a low, almost hissing voice. A chill crept up Barry's skin, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Suddenly, Nicole stared at Barry with a sharp gaze. There was something in her eyes that sent a shiver through Barry's veins. For a moment, there was a strange glint in her eyes, as if they weren't entirely human. But when Barry blinked, Nicole was smiling as usual, as though nothing had happened. "The wind here is strange," Nicole said, as if answering a question Barry hadn't asked. Her voice had a mocking tone, as though there was a secret only she and Jen knew. Clay, usually the brave one, started to look uneasy. "I think we should head into the tents before the rain gets worse," he suggested, trying to end a conversation that had grown uncomfortable. But before they could move, another wolf howl pierced the air. It was closer this time, more menacing. The sound mixed with the gusting wind and the rain that had begun to fall harder, making the atmosphere even more intense. Nicole and Jen kept smiling, but there was something behind their smiles that made both Barry and Clay uneasy. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and they retreated into their tents and fell asleep. The next morning, when the dew still clung to the ground of Grand Teton, Barry woke up first. The cold air stung his skin as he stepped out of the tent, taking a deep breath of the fresh mountain air. But something felt different this time. The usual peacefulness was replaced with a strange feeling, as if something was out of place. The fog lingered lightly among the trees, casting faint shadows over everything around him. Barry looked around, his eyes landing on the spot where Nicole and Jen's tent should have been. He frowned. Their tent was gone. Everything that had been there the night before, the tent, the gear, even the footprints in the dirt, had vanished, as if they had never been there. There were no signs of tent stakes being pulled out, and the ground looked smooth, as though it had never been touched at all. "Clay!" Barry called out, his voice trembling despite his effort to stay calm. Clay, still half asleep, let out a soft groan before finally stepping out of the tent with a confused expression. "What's going on?" Clay asked in a raspy voice, still trying to understand the situation. "Look, their tent!" Barry pointed toward the spot where Nicole and Jen's campsite should have been. Clay squinted, and his expression changed immediately. He walked over to the now empty space, furrowing his brow. "Did they leave?" Clay asked, his voice low but filled with confusion. Barry stepped closer, examining the area more carefully. There wasn't a single trace that a tent had ever been there. Normally, even with the neatest of setups, there would be some signs, footprints, trampled grass, or even bits of food left behind. But there was nothing. Everything looked clean, untouched. "This is strange," Barry muttered, the uneasy feeling growing inside him. "We talked with them until late last night, and their tent was right here. But now, maybe they left early?" Clay suggested, trying to offer an explanation, though he didn't sound convinced either. Barry shook his head. "Leave for where? And how could they go without leaving any trace at all?" The two exchanged glances, and a sudden silence fell between them. In Barry's mind, various possibilities flashed. Maybe they had moved to another spot to climb. Maybe they had continued their hike to Mount Tiwana's summit. Or maybe they had decided to leave early. But none of those explanations made sense as to how everything could vanish without a trace. "What did you hear last night?" Barry asked finally, trying to recall the strange sounds from the night before. The wolf howls, the whispering wind, the laughter that seemed normal but felt wrong. Last night, something didn't feel right. Clay didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the forest around them with a suspicious look, as if hoping to spot something hidden from view. But there was nothing there, only towering pine trees and the morning fog that hadn't fully lifted yet. "Well, maybe we're just overthinking it." Clay shrugged at last, trying to shake off the creeping fear settling inside him. "They probably just went somewhere else. Let's get on with our practice." Barry nodded, though the strange feeling still lingered. They packed up their gear and walked toward the cliff they had planned to climb. But even as they started climbing, Barry couldn't shake the image of Nicole and Jen from his mind. Every grip on the rock, every foothold, was accompanied by flashes of their eerie laughter from the night before. The wind blew softly, carrying faint whispers from the trees below. Occasionally, Barry felt a cold shiver down his spine, as if someone was watching him from a distance. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before continuing his climb. By the afternoon, after they finished their practice and prepared to head back, the uneasy feeling had grown even stronger. As they returned to the campsite to pack up their things, Barry glanced back at the spot where Nicole and Jen's tent had stood the day before. This time he was sure they wouldn't find any traces. The area was empty, silent, as if no one else had ever been there except the two of them. "We need to get out of here," Clay suddenly muttered, his voice firm. "Something's not right about this place." Barry nodded without saying a word. They quickly packed their gear into the car, eager to leave Grand Teton as soon as possible. However, as the car pulled away from the campsite, Barry glanced in the rearview mirror one more time. In the distance, among the shadows of the trees, he thought he saw two figures lurking, whether it was Nicole and Jen or whoever they truly were, smiling strangely from behind the fog. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to make Barry's heart race. That night, Barry and Clay arrived home, exhausted, but their minds were far from calm. Their trip to Grand Teton left them feeling uneasy, especially after that morning when they discovered Nicole and Jen's tent had vanished without a trace. Curiosity and unease crept over them, but they decided not to dwell on it too much and instead chose to rest. In silence, they unloaded their climbing gear into the garage. The atmosphere around them felt strange, as if something heavy lingered in the air, though they couldn't quite explain what it was. Clay occasionally glanced at Barry, trying to understand what was going on in his friend's mind. Barry felt the same. They both knew something was wrong, but neither dared to start the conversation. As they were almost done putting away the ropes, carabiners and harnesses, footsteps approached the garage door. Jackson, an old friend of Barry's, appeared with a wide smile, looking relaxed. Barry returned the smile weakly. Barry explained that they had just returned from Grand Teton after some rock climbing practice. Upon hearing that, something shifted in Jackson's expression. He pulled out his phone from his pocket and showed them a news article from an online site that had gone viral. 2 female climbers dead on East Face Trail, Grand Teton. The names and pictures in the article made Barry's blood run cold. Nicole and Jennifer from Ohio. Barry's eyes widened, and his body suddenly felt heavy. He couldn't believe what he was reading. His heart pounded harder, fear slowly taking over. Nicole and Jen. They had just been with those girls the day before. They laughed and shared stories by the campfire. Barry swallowed hard, his stomach turning with nausea. Clay stepped closer, his expression tense as he looked at the article on Jackson's phone. "I couldn't have seen wrong," Barry muttered to himself, though his voice was barely audible. Jackson looked confused by both of their reactions, unsure of what was happening. The news reported that they had fallen while climbing on the East Face Trail, their ropes snapping, and they were found dead last weekend. Last weekend. How was that possible? If Nicole and Jen had died last weekend, then who had they met yesterday? Who climbed with them, sat by the campfire, laughing and sharing stories about their adventures? Suddenly, Barry reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with slightly trembling hands. He opened the photo gallery, intending to check the videos and pictures he had taken during the climb. But as he scrolled, the feeling of nausea in his stomach grew stronger. Empty. There was nothing. The photos that should have been there, photos and videos of Nicole and Jen climbing, the foggy scenery of Grand Teton, were gone. Gone without a trace, as if they had never existed. Who was watching Barry nervously, pulled out his phone and did the same. The result was identical. Nothing. No photos, no videos, no evidence that they had ever been with Nicole and Jen. The air in the garage suddenly felt cold, colder than before. Barry's skin prickled, and Clay began to shiver. What had previously felt odd now became terrifying. The faces of Nicole and Jen, as they appeared in their memories, suddenly seemed much more frightening. They had laughed together, but now that laughter echoed cold and hollow in Barry's mind, like the distant sound of something long dead. Jackson, still unable to fully grasp what was happening, looked at them with confusion. Did you really meet them? He asked, not yet understanding the depth of the fear creeping over Barry and Clay. Barry didn't answer. He just stood there, feeling trapped between reality and a nightmare, unable to comprehend what had happened. His thoughts raced. Was any of it real? Were we imagining things? Or did we somehow cross into something we shouldn't have? The uncertainty gnawed at him, deepening the fear that maybe they had encountered something far beyond human understanding. Did we imagine everything? Was it all just some twisted trick of the mind? He couldn't shake the thought that maybe they had crossed into something beyond the natural, something dark and inexplicable. His voice stuck in his throat, his vision blurred. In his mind, only one question kept repeating. If Nicole and Jen were already dead, then who did they meet yesterday?